I'm joined now by the Sunday Times' Mark Urban. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Hugo.
Thanks for being with us. So, look, that's an additional £15 in funding that's been allocated to defence. It is, of course, well short of the $28 billion the Ministry of Defence asked for. I suppose it's important to acknowledge that overall military spending is well over £60 billion. How much difference does that shortfall make?
Well, yes. I mean, this is the crux of the matter, I think, really. Whether the kind of language that the government used when it brought out its defence review last summer about, putting us on a war footing and being ready to confront other states is actually being made real, whether those promises are being fleshed out in financial terms. Now, of course, we know that John Healey resigned, the outgoing Defence Secretary, because he was given a figure of about 13 billion. So, as you say, we've heard a figure of 15 billion. That's over 4 years. So effectively what you're saying is about 500 million extra a year compared with the sum that John Healey looked at and felt that's just not possible. We can't do our job. He spelled that out in his resignation letter. So we've had some big, brave headlines, as it were, from the government this morning. And of course, the basic assertion that they have reversed the long-term decline in UK defence spending, the so-called peace dividend, call it what you will, when we switched money away from the forces in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, is right. They have reversed that decline, and they are increasing defence spending. The problem, and the reason why I think people in the defence world will be pretty sceptical about what's been announced today, is the kind of pace of spend that's required to meet what we've told NATO we will do. That sort of amount that we've said last year at a summit in The Hague that we would do in terms of increasing defence spending, that's not there.
Yeah, sure. And look, I mean, as compares to the rest of NATO, how are we doing and how will we be doing after this? Because, of course, NATO is made up of its constituent nations. Are we lagging?
Well, if you go back to 2014, when actually David Cameron at the NATO summit managed to get a higher defence spending target out of NATO members at the time, because we'd seen what had happened in Crimea, Putin being assertive in Ukraine, taking bits of Ukraine, and so that was a bit of a turning point. Now, to use this dreaded ratio, which is the proportion of our economic output, or GDP, that goes on defence, at the time of that 2014 summit, the aim was to get everyone to 2% of GDP on defence. Now, Britain comfortably met that at the time, and there were only 4 NATO countries that did. And the only one in Europe that spent a bigger proportion of its defence GDP on defence than we did back in 2014 was Greece, interestingly enough. Now, today, we're right down the chart. So there are now, I think, around 10 European NATO countries that spend more of their economy or budget on defence than we do, as a proportion of the total in each case. So lots of countries, people always talk about the ones that live next door to Russia, and obviously they feel the threat, in particular Poland, the Baltic republics, but also some of our other neighbours like Germany, Denmark, Norway, are increasing the spending much more rapidly than the UK.
Sure. Look, we did get some perhaps more exciting vision of what a future military might look like. He went on to announce plans to build a new hybrid Royal Navy and an army that is 10 times more lethal than the one we've got at the moment. What details do we know about what that's actually going to look like?
Well, the 10 times more lethal army is a line that was in last year's defence review, and that is about using more long-range rocket artillery, drones, all the rest of it. They've been talking in the last 24 hours, or revealing details about a programme to get autonomous or unpiloted air vehicles to fly in formation with the Army's attack helicopters, that kind of thing. That's all part of that. But I think the big eye-catching thing over the weekend has been the discussion about the future shape of the Navy. Now, depending on how you want to spin this, you can either say we're going to have 3 times as many large surface vessels as we do now, or you can say, well, they are going to build back up to a reasonable figure on those, about 19 frigates and destroyers, that sort of equivalent size of vessel, and then about twice as many uncrewed ships. Now, they have given us a bit more detail on that today, and if I was being, I think maybe cynical is the wrong word, but worldly wise, I would say it's rather interesting what they've revealed, because what they've talked about is sort of specialist platforms. So one of them, for example, is primarily to detect threats in the air. In other words, it will be a floating radar station. Another one is primarily to detect the submarine threats, that kind of thing. And then there are different platforms that they're talking about, or different uncrewed ships, call them what you want, that will actually be used to launch weapons against those aircraft or ships. Now, what I might say is, well, don't we have ships that do all of that in one package at the moment? But the problem with them is they're very expensive and you're afraid of losing them. And I think that's the approach we can see, that they're sort of disaggregating the key functions of what we would call an exquisite capability now. In other words, a warship that can do lots of different functions, but at very high cost. And that's the approach. Now, I think time will tell whether disaggregating and having one floating uncrewed vessel that is basically a radar station and another one that launches the missiles against, the aircraft or missiles that radar station detects, whether that's the right way. And it's, in that sense, it's a risk. It's an experiment, and if you like embracing risk and you're feeling bold, you can say that they're putting the Royal Navy ahead of many other nations in this. But undoubtedly, there are older people who've served in the Royal Navy who are, I think, by nature quite conservative or risk averse in terms of experimenting with military capability, who are, I think, a little worried about taking risk at that scale.
Finally, Mark, what are our allies saying about us at the moment? I don't mean the Americans, because we all know Donald Trump just says stuff, but I mean like our sort of traditional allies in Europe, the French, the Germans, and so on. Are they worried about all this sort of this drift, this underfunding, this delay, or are they going through similar issues themselves?
Well, and in our consideration of allies, let's not forget the one that makes the biggest effort now in terms of ground forces in Europe, which is Poland. Obviously, very closely allied to the British in World War II, and of course we've seen just over a week ago some rather critical remarks from Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, suggesting that the UK was not making enough effort on defence. The Germans, they've tried to keep the friendship strong. They've made post-Brexit a defence agreement with the UK, bilateral agreement, but they're not really happy either. And I think the Scandinavians are beginning to voice worry and criticism about the UK, because the UK is meant to be the lead nation in this grouping within NATO called the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is basically the Baltic and the Nordic countries. And the Nordic countries don't feel we're making enough of an effort to, perform that lead role on the Joint Expeditionary Force. Very important at a time when, as the Prime Minister said this morning, the old American guarantee of security in Europe can no longer be taken in the same way. So I think, my intuition, based on the figures we've heard so far, and I would stress we haven't had the actual plan, despite the Prime Minister's speech this morning yet, we're expecting it any moment, is that a lot of our allies will look at the detail and be a bit concerned that Britain is not switching resources, economy, money into the armed forces quickly enough to make these capabilities real.
Thank you very much indeed. Mark Urban, always good to speak to you. You can, of course, read Mark every week in the Sunday Times. Thank you, Mark.